Well, hello everyone. In our language here in northern Minnesota, on my Dakota side, we say "Ha Mitake Owasi." My relatives, hello, my relatives. Welcome to this carbon pricing briefing that's hosted by the Indigenous Environmental Network as part of the Oppose False Solutions briefing series. This is the third congressional briefing in this series that's sponsored by a number of organizations, IEN, Center for Biological Diversity, Climate Justice Alliance, Friends of the Earth US, Food and Water Watch, Greenpeace USA, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, Oil Change, Progressive Democrats of America, 0 Hour, and 350.org. Today, we have a number of speakers, and they will introduce themselves, but quickly to go through the order, I will start out myself. I'm starting out now. And then Dr. Tamara Gilbertson, who's our Indigenous Environmental Network Climate Change Policy Advisor, followed by Shauna Larson, coming from Alaska, Deputy Director of Native Movement, and Mr. Thomas Joseph from the California Kitchen. And as I start out in these presentations, it takes me back to reflecting one of our Indigenous leaders. In 1854, the great visionary Chief Seattle, he asked this question back then: high or sell the sky? Now, 164 years later, the sky is being bought and sold on carbon stock markets all over the world, including on California's cap and trade market and the East Coast RGGI system. As climate change continues to impact communities around the world, and especially here in our backyard domestically in the United States, policy solutions must reflect the needs of those most impacted by climate change and fossil fuel extraction. Unfortunately, as carbon pricing systems have proliferated over the last decade and a half, Indigenous peoples worldwide and here in the United States continue to be impacted both by climate change and climate change policies that violate most of our foundation of Indigenous traditional knowledge, our spirituality, our cosmology, and violate the rights to free, prior, and informed consent. The majority of the tools for mitigating climate change, both within the US and globally, focus on carbon markets, carbon pricing, and carbon counting, and continue to exploit people in communities most impacted by climate change, while providing special favors to the very fossil fuel and agricultural industry corporations most responsible for climate change. IEN has been involved in climate policy since 1998, locally, tribally, state, nationally, and internationally. We were called upon by our frontline communities, our traditional leadership, some of our tribal environmental programs. We came together in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1998 to articulate how climate change is affecting us. And that gave us the mandate as the Indigenous Environmental Network to work on climate change. I've been in consultation with spiritual leaders about the question of how does the quantification, how does the commodification and the privatization of air, of carbon and greenhouse gases, and bringing that into a market trading system, how do we articulate that as Indigenous peoples? Most all of our spiritual leaders took a long time to dwell on that question. And I must say, in the final conclusion that has taken me on the road, not only in the North, but in the South as well, asking this question. Most of our Indigenous spiritual leaders said it's a violation of the sacred. It's not serious to us. So we're going to start now. Keep your questions Hold your questions to the end. We have a goal of trying to have some time for question and answers. So thank you very much. Welcome to this series. It's very historical to be in this situation to talk with you all. Tamara.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate showing up for this today. I'm going to share my screen in just a few slides and we'll get started. Many of us have been working on following the various systems of pricing pollution that have proliferated over the last 20 plus years. This is not a new thing. There's over 57 carbon pricing initiatives active in the world, 46 national, 28 subnational. And the reason that that number doesn't match is because those, they mix, they match, and they overlap. There are new initiatives around the world that combine carbon taxes and cap and trade systems, the UN-based RED systems, which is the big forest offset program, and a multitude of other iterations of carbon pricing today, underneath the umbrella of carbon pricing systems. These are multi-billion-dollar trading schemes that have largely, over the last few decades, supported the fossil fuel industries. And there's no evidence that shows that they've actually reduced emissions. So I'm going to go through a few fundamental flaws today quite quickly. The first fundamental flaw that I want to focus on is the market volatility of cap and trade systems and any sort of what Tom calls carbon stock market systems. We have ample evidence that has shown the European Union emissions trading system, tanked out by 2013, and was brought back to, has been brought back to life because the government stepped in to create a backloading system. Like most financialized markets in the world, they often do count on government and state systems to jump in and keep those markets rolling. We've seen the same thing in the Clean Development Mechanism run by the United Nations that tanked out around the same time. And important to note that this is sold by one unit being 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, or equivalent to the 6 greenhouse gases. And each one of those 1 ton can be worth a lot of money or a bit of money or even less money. And they shrink and they expand based on how much it's worth in a market. So it asks us the question of how much do you value pollution? And when it's valued at almost nothing, remember the corporations can buy lots of that, bank that, hold that over, and they're not held accountable for pollution. The second fundamental flaw I want to focus on are the carbon cycles, or an idea and very important to understand. When fossil fuels are kept underground in the earth, or what's sometimes called the inactive carbon cycle, or the slow carbon cycle, those fossil fuels are safe. They are not impacting the carbon cycle on the surface of the planet, in the atmosphere and the biosphere, or the clouds and the oceans and the trees, and all living things interact, what's called the active sometimes, or the fast cycle. And it's taken the Earth thousands of years to create a carbon cycle that we can survive in, that we survive in. But when fossil fuels are extracted and combusted, they are then put into that system and disrupt it, and disrupts that fast carbon cycle, or that active carbon cycle. And the Earth is not an infinite sponge then to suck at all of those pollutions down. In fact, scientists estimate that even if we were to turn off the tap of fossil fuel pollution, it would take thousands of years for the Earth to basically figure out a way to transform the existing greenhouse gas pollution. Fundamental flaw number 3 is that carbon pricing systems, they don't do anything physically with it. They don't really reduce pollution. We have no evidence to that case. In fact, most researchers have found that it's regulation that has actually stepped in to reduce the pollution, or different moments of economic crises. The fourth fundamental flaw I want to focus on is around carbon taxes. We've done some research on carbon taxes that have shown that countries that have had long-standing carbon taxes are not actually reducing pollution either. In fact, what we find is that the carbon tax can easily be passed on to the consumers, that can impact workers' wages. And this isn't a polluting pay strategy. It's quite easy for fossil fuel industries to pass along the cost. This is why we've seen, protests in France and Canada in the last few years as well. Also, carbon taxes can act as a stepping stone to set up infrastructure for cap and trade programs and to link them together, like we've seen in Mexico and Colombia. Also, carbon taxes are a drop in the bucket for big multinational, transnational corporations. There's lots of ways to deal with taxes. Instead of making a carbon tax, which is an ex post facto issue, right? It's already out of the ground. You're creating an economic dependency on pollution, on needing pollution for that revenue. Why not shift fossil fuel subsidies away towards just transition? The latest trends that I want to focus on right now are around carbon pricing as this umbrella term that includes carbon taxes, cap and trade, the UN Forest Offset Program, RED, and a multitude of other types of carbon trading, carbon systems underneath that umbrella. We're seeing a massive proliferation in the voluntary markets, and we have in the last 2 years. And this is largely due to various private sector pledges, such as from the aviation industry, large corporations like Microsoft and others that are starting to push for what's called, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of this, so-called net zero emissions. As net zero emissions is this idea that if you have a ledger or an Excel sheet and every single day you have your pollution, sort of written out there, and you total that up at the bottom, which is the pollution, right, or your emissions, and then you subtract that from something, you get what would be net zero emissions. The question is, what is being subtracted? And the answer then is more types of offsets. So fundamental flaw number 5 is around net zero emissions, which is being called, corporations and governments are saying we can be net zero by 2030, 2050 pledges, as well as carbon neutral by doing 2 different things that I want to focus on now. One is nature-based solutions, which is basically land-based offsets for soil, carbon, and forests that I'll talk about in a moment. And the other one is carbon capture and storage, carbon capture utilization and storage, carbon capture and sequestration, bioenergy for carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and a whole host of other things. There are today an estimated 26 carbon capture and storage plants in the world. However, 81% of those are carbon capture and storage facilities that use enhanced oil recovery. Enhanced oil recovery is basically compressing CO2, injecting it into the ground for the purpose of pulling out more oil and gas, which then goes through refinery and combustion processes and adds more CO2 to the atmosphere. There are questions around, there's no guarantee that the CO2 will stay underground. There's questions around leaking, around earthquakes, and ultimately, and most importantly to note, is that this is a process by which the corporations use this to pull oil and gas out of the ground, thus creating more climate change. Nature-based solutions, on the other hand, are basically land-based offsets. There is a huge push today, not only in the United States through domestic policy, and I'm sure you're aware of those bills that are sitting on the Hill and due to come back very soon, but also internationally. Now, of course, we want programs for soil and agriculture, but not linked to a market, okay? And these are, the reason for this as well is because forest offsets are sort of starting to max out. They've been around for a long time. They have targeted Indigenous people that my colleagues are going to speak about in a moment. But there is this need with these net zero targets or net zero emission targets for more offsets. and a large voluntary market that has superseded the international compliance markets. They've superseded the domestic compliance markets. So there is a push for both of these in parallel to expand in the next few years. In summary, carbon pricing doesn't work. It is fundamental flaw number one is market volatility. The state needs to come in always and prop up the markets. Fundamental flaw number two is around carbon cycles that don't match up. The earth is not an infinite sponge for the fossil fuel industry. Fundamental flaw number three, it doesn't reduce greenhouse gases. We actually have no evidence after 20 years. This is business as usual for fossil fuel corporations. Fundamental flaw number four, carbon taxes are a distraction. It's a drop in the bucket, and it's passed on at the pump to the poorest people who need to be able to have transportation. Fundamental flaw number five, net zero emissions is just more carbon offsets for nature-based solution and carbon capture and storage. Carbon pricing is a distraction. It's like the house is on fire, and rather than putting it out, we're throwing on a box of fireworks. You know, it looks nice, it sounds nice, but it is a massive distraction. So I know you're saying, what do you want to do? What's your solution? We want to see a massive shift of fossil fuel and nuclear subsidies towards indigenous just transition, especially for community-based wind and solar programs, food sovereignty programs, and a whole host of other initiatives. We have a list, we have a program. And we want to see fossil fuels kept in the ground at source. Regulation does work. Please see the website, the Indigenous Environmental Network website, on the principles of just transition. For more information, check the websites. Please check out the briefing and see the materials that are in the folder that I sent out earlier today. Thank you so very much for being here, and I'm very happy to pass this on now to Shauna Larson.
And Sarita Chamakat, I'm Shauna Larson. I'm Sukhbit on my mom's side from the village of Port Graham. I'm Atna Athabaskan on my dad's side from the village of Naidiniana, also known as Chickaloon Village. Today I am calling in from the occupied territories of the Dena'ina Dene people. These are the unceded territories. The people of this land never sold anything or gave any rights up. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Environmental Justice Program Director at Native Movement. I also serve on our Traditional Tribal Council at Chickaloon Village. So thank you for having me. I guess some of the fundamental issues that I wanted to talk about are about the sacredness of our relationship as Indigenous people with the land, the air, the water, and the animals. In Alaska, we have 220 federally recognized tribes, which is just under half of the nation's tribes. Instead of reservations, we got corporations. And so in 1971, the state of Alaska was divided into 13 regions. And at that point, they created 13 regional corporations, as well as creating over 200 small village corporations. The land and the money was given to these native corporations to manage. And the people, although we do get occasional dividends, we have very little say over how the corporations move forward. And so essentially what we're seeing here is the traditional Indigenous people are the stewards of the land. We're taking care of the land and the animals, the air and the plants. And then our native corporations are then commodifying that and selling it to these fossil fuel corporations, who then in turn are putting those onto the carbon market. And so essentially that of course leads to the fact that it doesn't, these solutions, these false solutions do not reduce greenhouse gases, and they contribute to climate change, which of course in Alaska we are seeing at an extremely high rate. We have hunters that are falling into the sea ice where the ice should be frozen. All kinds of things are happening in Alaska because of climate change. The tree lines are changing, which is bringing beavers into new areas they've never been before, which is bringing giardia or beaver fever into regions that it's never been before. And so we are really seeing all sorts of different changes in our environment. And I guess the thing that I'm always trying to explain, and that is not technical, but something that I'm kind of constantly trying to ask people who are bilingual is, how do you talk about concepts in a language that has no words for a concept? And I have spoken to Spanish speakers, and they say Spanish is a very rich language, and there are many concepts that cannot be translated into English. And so when we talk about that, all of our original stories, our original instructions talk about our relationship with the land, the animals, the plants, the air, the water, and each other. It also speaks to our responsibility, because the relationship and the responsibility are paramount in the way that we steward and relate to the land. But I guess I would just say that it's almost like in US culture or Westernized culture, that the idea of sacredness is only related to religion. And as an Indigenous person who has original instructions on how to take care of the land in our area, we have all the stories and all the instructions that we need, but we understand the sacredness of our relationship and our responsibilities. And that sacredness is told in many, many stories all over the world as it relates to Indigenous people, but in particular, with my personal experience, our original instructions really pertain to us in terms of the way that we have to take care of the land and what our responsibilities are. And because there's no consultation and no accountability as the government is moving forward and allowing the corporations to participate in these sort of fossil fuel Ponzi schemes or these shell games, it is causing an assault really on our traditional and ancestral and spiritual way of life. It is, as I said before, just helping to ramp up climate change in our area. And we're seeing it as entire communities are sliding into the ocean and having to be relocated. So many things. The rivers aren't freezing. So the people who used to use the sled dogs and snow machines to get up and down the river, they are not able to, it's so warm that the rivers aren't freezing the way that they used to. Even fishing out on lake ice and those types of things are much more dangerous than they ever were before. So with that, I thank you all, and I will pass it on to my colleague, Thomas Joseph.
Thank you, Shauna. My name is Thomas Joseph Heyang Kugamayo. To all the rest of the human beings out there, I am a Hoopa Valley tribal member, which is now considered part of Northern California, and I'm joining this conversation from the Nesaan people, which are in the Rancho Cordova area, which is the greater Sacramento area. And it's an honor to be here and with this team and presenting this information. And I really want to imply the urgency of this message, as well as the importance of the message that you carry to the Congress representatives that you're going to be reporting this to, and that it's vital, you know. And just to start it off, that we see carbon markets cause real problems, and in a time when we're facing our greatest threat to humankind, we see us following the same systems that have gotten us there in the first place. You know, climate change will be one of the greatest threats to mankind, and here we are addressing it in the same manner that has caused this problem. And if we look towards Indigenous peoples, we see that Indigenous peoples hold tenure over 80% of the Earth's biodiversities, and it's because of their ancestral knowledge and their values that they've been able to protect this and protect these regions from desecration, as we see across the globe. My ancestral lands of the Hoopa people, I'm from the village of Natinaway and Sewinalden, and and my father's people is from Owens Valley or Payonada in Southern California, and we have seen both of these regions devastated by the effects of climate change. One becoming a high desert that used to be plush with rainforests and grasslands, and then here in Northern California, my mother's ancestral lands, we've seen 100,000 acres decimate our ancestral forest because of the effects of climate change. And so, you know, then the recent issues that happened in Texas. And so this is moving. Climate change is real. It is affecting lives, and it's going to continue to affect primarily BIPOC communities and the communities that are most marginalized. In a time that we should be relying on the value systems of Indigenous peoples to address climate change, we're doing the opposite. We're actually undermining and targeting the Indigenous knowledge and the tenure that they have over these lands, using these lands for carbon sinks and false solutions of climate change. Targeting marginalized communities isn't a new tactic. This has been something that has been done time and time again, and BIPOC communities have always received the brunt force of this. If you look in Southern California with fracking wells, you can see fracking wells, then some homes, then some more fracking wells. If you look in the Bay Area and look at the oil refinery there in Richland, these points of infrastructure, these points of destruction are in our communities, and we see that the Indigenous communities, as other BIPOC communities, that because of health disparities and other means, you know, you look at native lands in the Midwest and even in Southern Oregon, where our river is being threatened by pipelines. And so targeting marginalized communities is something that we need to start addressing and changing as we're moving towards a just transition in climate change. We've seen carbon markets also remove forest dwellers in regions that they have consisted in South and Central America, limiting access to our ancestral lands, and they deny our traditional means of land management, as that we're not able to manage our lands in a way that was sustainable and a reciprocal relationship with our Mother Earth. You know, Indigenous peoples have a deep relationship with our Mother Earth, but we also understand that this relationship is reciprocal. She also has a relationship with us. And as we're moving forward to get us to a sustainable level of meeting climate change, we really need to be able to look towards Indigenous peoples and the values that they hold in order to get us to scale. Carbon markets truly are threatening Indigenous ways of being. Tribal nations have been groomed for carbon markets. If we look at the failure of the trust responsibilities of the federal government and the treaties that were created with these Indigenous nations, it has put our Indigenous communities in great need of healthcare. We have a lack of healthcare. We have high poverty rates. The continual onslaughts of genocide that have been targeting our communities, from boarding schools to Indian Relocation Act, even the mascots and the undermining of our identity. You know, a lot of people's first interaction with Indigenous peoples is the cartoon characters, you know, that you see. And then after the cartoon characters, you have the mascots when you go to high school. And so from a very young age, American citizens have been have been led down a path to undermine our indigenous sovereignties and our ways of being. And that's another way of grooming our tribal lands for the harvesting of our Mother Earth. You know, the foreign governing practices that have been applied upon our people, where we now have to rule with a majority rule, our indigenous peoples never operated in that manner. We move together collectively as a whole. If a majority rules, then there's a group of people that's being left behind. And so these new practices have also prepared our communities for accepting carbon markets, or accepting this mindset that they have to be able to join, assimilate into the American culture. And the patriarchal leadership, the majority of our indigenous communities were matriarch led, and that these democratic processes, a lot of our tribal leaders are using carbon markets as a means of bringing in revenue for re-election promises and campaigns. And if we really wanted to get serious about addressing the trust responsibility of the federal government, we need to put in consideration of a UBI for indigenous communities, universal basic income, as part of a just transition policy towards climate change, so that indigenous peoples don't feel like they have to sell out their values and their cultural values in order to put food on the table for their families. You know, carbon traders come with false solutions for our people, and they act like they're doing us a favor. They come into our communities promising these big dollars that they can address the needs of our people, which were really caused by the lack of trust responsibility of the federal government, and that they are just basically another wave of treaty signers. These contracts are 100-year contracts, so we're selling out the future for the benefit of a few dollars today. And carbon traders threaten tribal sovereignty and people. There is no free, prior, informed consent, no FPIC by these tribal nations are given to these tribal nations. There's actually an undermining of free, prior, informed consent by these carbon traders that come into our communities. They actually study our laws and constitutions with ideas to get the contract approved with the little method of resistance. We've seen this time and time again inside my community, the Hoopa Valley tribe, where we've been able to keep carbon markets off of our council tables for like the last 7 years now. But our neighboring tribe has succumbed to the pressures of the high dollar that's being offered. And yet those tribal members never receive the benefit or even see those dollars in real time. It's given to a bank, and it's tied up in other ways. These carbon markets, these carbon dealers also come into our communities with the intent of causing this division, and they use insiders. They'll pay tribal members to promote their false agendas. They'll use terms and methods that we use for sustainability, for protecting our environment. They co-opt them into their own terminology, thinking that they are doing the right thing, or they know that they're not, but they're promoting that they're doing the right thing by using our values. And so FPIC is a great concern for many tribal nations. Free, prior, informed consent must be given to tribal membership along with their leadership in a method that is informative and clear, and not causing division or falsehoods. And I know that Biden's administration has recently addressed free, prior, informed consent amongst Indian tribes in America. But that is the same policy that Obama took. It's almost word for word, and it didn't work underneath the Obama administration. And so we have very little faith that it'll work underneath the Biden administration. Free, prior, informed consent really needs to come from the people themselves, and not the guidelines from outside agencies. The intent of carbon markets is really to gain access to unceded territories. If we see that indigenous peoples are holding 80% of the world's biodiversities, this is a means of gaining access to those biodiversities, to those unceded territories. It's also, carbon markets are also just another method of forced assimilation, by making us neglect our traditional values and ways of being in order to go for the American dream. The intent of carbon markets is to divide with false solutions. It divides the environmental justice movement. It divides tribal nations, and it prevents us from moving forward with real solutions to get us to scale to address climate change. I believe that that's the method. You know, we're not going to. It was created by the elites in order to keep the elites in power, in order to keep the elites being able to gain more access to unceded territories and keep us pitted against each other, not having the ability to get to scale in order to address climate change. We have a knowledge-based system that runs deeper than any science or any university. It's been here since the time immemorial. We were the first scientists of these lands. We were the first patriots of these lands, and we will continue to be so. But we need to be able to allow us to thrive and grow, allow us to be the example to the rest of the nation in order for us to protect our Mother Earth in a manner that is reciprocal, in a manner that can get us to scale in meeting climate change. Evidence has demonstrated that, as Tamara has shown, that these are false solutions, and coming together with real solutions, we must be fast-tracked and brought to the table. We need to be able to be at that decision-making table in order to uplift the Indigenous voices. And schemes and false solutions, we don't have time for it anymore. Climate change is upon us, and we need to be able to address it. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Shauna. Thank you, Tamara. So much to cover and to talk about. Ever since I started to work on climate policy, and these specific issues started, like I said, in 1998. But every year that we brought a delegation to the International Climate Meeting, and along with watching the U.S. State Department delegation, sometime, you know, I mean, 70 to 100 people in the State Department delegation at these international meetings, when small island states barely had one person sitting at the table representing the serious climate change issues. Sure, times have changed, but I remember in those early years, I had to grapple with this discussion of carbon trading, carbon offsets, and privatization. It involves the privatization. Before you bring the trading of carbon and air into a trading system, you got to determine whose property right it is. That's something that was very alarming to many of our people and other communities, that it's a property right issue. Who has a right to trade and trade carbon credits? And those kind of questions came to us as Indigenous peoples, huh? And that's why we have such a strong position against it, both, you know, within the framework of our teachings, our philosophy, our cosmology, but also with the question, is it really a tool for reducing emissions at source? I want to respect time here, and I think we have Shaw is one of our comms media tech persons, and I think you may have some questions that have come over.
If anyone does have questions, they can list it in the chat box for the panelists.
Yeah, either one, the chat box, or there is also a feature Q&A in the Zoom window. We have a question from Janice Waite about, the question is, what are some solutions for making carbon tax more equitable? I'm going to ask Tamara, since you've done substantial study on carbon tax and carbon dividends, if you could respond to that question. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the question. I think When we've looked at carbon taxes, we don't see it actually being a solution to climate change. So if people want to tax the fossil fuel industry, yes, tax the fossil fuel industry, but don't say that you're doing it to fix or solve climate change, because taxes don't function that way. And what we've seen with evidence in other places is that the taxes, the costs are passed on. Also, it creates this, it's an ex post facto issue in terms of creating an economic dependency on pollution where the fossil fuels are already out of the ground. So I can't say that I have a upper strategy for it to make it more equitable. I would say tax the fossil fuel industries, but don't say that you're doing it as a solution to climate change, and keep it out of the realm of carbon taxes, because that can also be used and infused into cap and trade programs and a whole host of other carbon pricing programs. I'll leave that question there. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara. There's another question here. Can you talk about how Indigenous peoples have been displaced from lands by carbon pricing? I think, and in thinking about that, it's a good question. We got the application of carbon pricing mechanisms of a voluntary carbon offset initiatives, both domestically in the United States and Canada, including Alaska. But this question reminds me of this long history since the early 2000s, when forests became part of the discussion out of the Kyoto Protocol to be included in this market system as the carbon sinks of forests, ecosystems, tropical Amazon forests. And there was a lot of discussion on that. And as I observed the implementation of these voluntary market systems that are called reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, or RED, we started to see cases to where, as the investments of polluting industry, like Chevron, for an example, investing in carbon credits in Ecuador, in the Amazon, and looking good on paper as they run ads in National Geographic that they've gone carbon neutral, that they're offsetting their pollution. So they look good in these ads. But what is really happening on the ground in the Amazon, in the tropical forests, is that these trees that they invested in purchasing the carbon, renting the carbon, you could say, that's their trees, quote unquote. And there's been formations in numerous cases of these forests, these park systems. And even in some of these, there's park police to keep indigenous and local community. Some of these communities in the forested region don't meet the definition of indigenous. They're mestizo. Even the local communities don't have access to the forest anymore. And there's been removals of indigenous peoples or prohibitions of indigenous people entering their own territories. This happened in Kenya as well. We do have reports of these we can send to you. There's numerous publications that have reported this. When Tamara was the director of Carbon Trade Watch, there is a lot of research on this, of indigenous peoples being removed from these territories that become the the sponge for the polluting industry. And the governments look the other way. we look at the implication, I've shifted into international. We have concerns like in the Congo. Already there are populations like the pygmy, for an example, whose human rights are being violated. And they're making, not the pygmy, but the Congo Republic is investing heavily in these carbon offsets. And so we've talked to international human rights lawyers, is how can these different tribal populations, their rights being protected rather than being forced outside of their territories. These are critical concerns where human rights NGOs have had much debate. Thank you. A question for Thomas Joseph. Do you believe carbon offsets have impact on sovereignty issues? And what do you say to people who believe that they actually reduce pollution?
Yes, I do believe it is a sovereignty issue. As Tom Goldtooth was talking about, it's a properties rights issue. Who does that carbon really belong to? And so it's not only it's a sovereignty right issue. And then the second part of that question is like, do I believe that it? No, I don't. I don't believe that this is a real solution to climate change. It's a mathematical scheme. It's cooking the books. At the end of the day, you're cooking the books. And if you look at just a California example alone, carbon emissions have increased since the creation of carbon markets in California and the Tropical Forest Standard. Air quality has gotten worse since then, not better. And so it is a false solution. And it's a sovereignty right issue because of FPIC and many of other reasons why. Free, prior, informed consent is not given to the tribal leadership. They have been coerced into it. They have the presentation of these carbon schemes have been done in shady ways. Like, you can email me. We can get into the shady ways these carbon traders have came into my community and our neighboring tribes to get them to wheel and deal these carbon trades. There's no equability with it. And so it not only is it a threat to tribal sovereignty, it's we're barking up the wrong tree. At California Kitchen, an organization that I run here, we have actually been focused more on how is our community going to live through climate change, because no real solutions are being presented. If this is the presentation if this is the method that the nation states of the world are going to use to address climate change with more false solutions in carbon markets and schemes that's got us in this mess, we really need to start preparing our indigenous communities to live through climate change, which means protecting our sovereignty at the utmost. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question. I'm studying this question. I understand the question, and it concerns those of you that have studied admissions overall, either by countries or in the United States. There's a lot of data on the level of greenhouse gas emissions, releases, and there's differences between urban or city areas and rural areas. So we can't assume anything. Some of our relatives from where I live in northern Minnesota, in North Dakota, which is very rural, the density area, population area out there is something that we can't assume just because it's in the rural area that the air pollution is clean. Coal-fired power plants were pretty predominant out there. They're still functioning out there. There's the fracking development from the Bakken oil field. There's flaring. There's a lot of data on air pollution, and you can see that whole area. And with satellites, it's like a city of all the flaring at night. It's devastating. So part of this question was that, haven't carbon markets been shown to reduce emissions overall? That's a question that I like to direct over to Tamara again. haven't carbon markets been shown to reduce emissions overall, but increase emissions in environmental justice communities? Couldn't we just ensure emissions are going down everywhere by tweaking the market? That's a loaded question, but Tamara, can you take a stab at that one?
Yeah, geez, thanks for that loaded question. Some research has shown that there are definitely hotspots of emissions that may have been lowered, but again, the research is not that clear around environmental justice communities. What we do know is that, again, after almost more than 20 years of pricing carbon and greenhouse gases, that we are in a situation where climate change is increasing. This is not something that's going to happen in the future. This is something that's happening now. And tweaking the markets, or we were told in the early days that it had teething problems, or that the market it needed to get bigger. It needed to go big or go home. A lot of similar rhetoric that you'll hear from the fossil fuel industry. I don't think tweaking it is the answer, again, which is why I laid out those fundamental flawed points earlier. What we do need to do is we need to come up with real solutions to climate change. And again, I ask you to go and check out the Indigenous Principles of Just Transition. And there's a whole host of other great resources in the folder. Okay, thank you.
In addition, if I can add, for those folks that have questions about, how do we explain what our concerns are, or just transition, in the state of Alaska, we have the town of Kodiak, which has about 5,000 people, and it includes a couple of different tribal nations that are located on that island. It has the world's 5th largest deep water port, and it's 98%, the entire town is run on sustainable energy, both hydro and wind, as well as a little bit of solar. And so as much as our congressional representatives like to talk about wanting to open up the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge and to continue drilling and really looking at these false solutions, we have one of the best kept secrets of just transition right here in the heart of Alaska, as a completely sustainable, almost completely sustainable town that's operating, and the Coast Guard is located in Kodiak, Alaska, utilizing a lot of that renewable energy as well. So I just wanted to add that in.
I'm just wondering, Tamara or Thomas, if you have any last comments. We have 2.5 minutes left here.
Yeah, in closing, I just want to share this little quick statement that, we don't need to be using indigenous lands for carbon sinks. We did not create this problem. It should not be, we should not be paying the blunt price for climate change. Not only the southern part of the hemisphere, but indigenous communities here in America are being faced with the choice between helping to address climate change, which these are false solutions. It doesn't address climate change, or sustain our families and put food on our tables, or the other choice, which is continue with our ancestral knowledge, with our indigenous wisdom that has protected these lands since time immemorial. My tribe is one of the very last tribes in the United States to have contact. We've had contact for 174 years, and we have witnessed the devastation of our ancestral lands by the hands of the United States, by the hands of the state of California, by these counties that are now calling it their home. And it's ridiculous, you know, overnight, it's basically overnight. My tribe has lived there for over 10,000 years. And overnight, we have seen the destruction of our forest, of our rivers, the contamination of our streams. And now they're wanting to use our last remaining forests for carbon sinks over something that we didn't create this mess. It's not on our hands. And so what I'm urging everybody to do is to understand the importance of Indigenous knowledge and uplift it and protect the last remaining biodiversities by standing with the and giving the due the trust responsibilities of the federal government by abiding by those treaties, as well as uplifting their sovereignty to the utmost. Because if we uplift and stand with these tribal nations, we will be able to address climate change with real means and protect California from raging fires if they allow us to manage it in the traditional means that we used to be able to. But yeah, there's no time to be hecking, tweaking any type of anything. We need solutions now.
Well, with that said, thank you, Thomas, Joseph, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And we do have some information we put into your packet. There's a couple emails I posted in the chat. If you need more information, if any of you want to get some more training on this critical topic, we do 8-hour, 2-day trainings in some areas, and there are solutions. And where is the funding going to come from? We understand those are the critical questions. Who's going to fund our transition away from a fossil fuel economy? So, you know, we do have information in our carbon pricing publication, A Critical Perspective for Community Resistance, that talks about fossil fuel subsidies. So I thank you very much and appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.